everyone. I'm John OLoughlin. Welcome to my channel. It's called McDuff Lives. And this morning here in the East Coast of United States, we are welcoming Harley Schlanger from Potsdam, Germany, who joins us every other week for a news analysis and some opinion and some frank talk about what the heck is really going on in this world. And I'm so grateful to have Harley Schlanger join us from the LaRouche organization. Good morning, Harley. Oh, we're not hearing you, Harley.
Okay, now you hear me.
Yes, sir.
Okay. All right. Sometimes I get confused with mute and unmute.
I see you've been very busy, so we forgive you.
Okay. Well, on top of everything else, I was telling Andy I'm fighting some of this tree pollen. I've had some bad allergies, and I think it's being brought into Germany by either Putin or Xi Jinping. So NATO better get on it.
Yeah, let's ask Joe Biden. He's got the latest intelligence on the pollen plot.
Yeah, a new form of cyber warfare.
Yeah, well, it works.
Yeah.
We're not suffering too much right here right now, but we did have a pretty heavy spring, and
Well, we had a late spring, so that's why it's just hitting here now in Potsdam.
Yes. Well, good morning to everyone in the chat. So great to have you all here with us, and Tyrone, and very grateful to A. Baker for serving as our moderator this morning. Kathy Sue is here, and Timothy Judd's here, the great violinist from our celebration of my dad's life. So great to have you here, Timothy. Let's ask you this question to begin with. Is there anything a big news flash that's hit you lately? Something that's like, wow, that I didn't expect that, or that's big. What would you say is the biggest thing on your mind right now, news-wise?
Well, I think what we're seeing is some things that were in process for quite a while. That on the one hand, you have the week of summits, and that's gone as I had expected. If you read my articles that I've been writing, it was the preparation for this was the whole promotion of this idea of the rules-based order and the designation of Russia and China as rules breakers. So there's nothing really new in that. One thing that did catch my attention was the announcement that was in the Wall Street Journal the other day about how BlackRock is taking the huge volume of funds from the Federal Reserve that they're getting and using it to buy up foreclosed homes, or going in and buying homes that aren't foreclosed yet, but trying to make themselves the largest homeowner in the United States, and then make them available for single families as rentals. So I think we saw this in 2008. And of course, the champion of that then was Steve Mnuchin with his IndyMac Bank. Mnuchin bought a bank and went in and took over all kinds of foreclosed properties, and then made a fortune reselling them when the money was pumped back in. Not surprisingly, Mnuchin was the one who brought in BlackRock to handle the COVID relief package, and BlackRock is putting together a huge fund to buy up whole blocks of cities. So that, again, that's not something unexpected or new, but that's something that definitely caught my attention, the fact that the Wall Street Journal covered it.
Let's back up and say, who is BlackRock for those of us that don't know, or perhaps I've heard the name a lot of times, but I may not be completely focused as you are on exactly what that means when they say BlackRock is doing these things.
Well, it's the world's largest financial asset manager. And they say that at the beginning of last year, they had $7 trillion they were managing. Then at the end of last year, the figure was 10 trillion, and now I'm told it's 12 to 14 trillion. So they've nearly doubled in the size of the assets they're managing, largely as a result of their position handling the bailout funds through the Federal Reserve. Now, by asset manager, that means that they have very wealthy individuals plus pension funds and other kinds of large funds that get turned over to them to invest and to turnover, make profits, and so BlackRock is the largest of these. Larry Fink is the CEO of BlackRock, and he got his start dealing with mortgage-backed securities. So not surprising that he's going back into real estate, but he's doing it on money from the Federal Reserve. I mean, it's one of these scams that is supposed to be helping Main Street Americans, small business, and so on. And somehow the money ends up in the pocket of the same group of people, the same small group of speculators. So that's what BlackRock is.
I started having visions of a guy standing on the street with a little table in front of him with three half coconuts and a little nut that he puts in underneath of one of them, and he stands there and shifts this stuff around, and you bet that you can figure out where the nut is. And I think that's kind of a good metaphor for what these financial institutions do, because they hide everything so well, and then you get all confused. Like, is BlackRock and Blackwater maybe the same thing? I mean,
No.
why would they choose the same? They've definitely got black hearts. Let's agree on.
Well, black hearts, and the old term for the oligarchy in Europe was the black nobility, the ones who controlled the finances of the emperors. And these were, especially in Italy, you had the Guelphs and the Ghibellines fighting. The Guelph faction was essentially the bankers for the Vatican and the Venetian traders. And then it moved into Habsburg Empire, into Germany. And so that was the term that the black nobility was, especially those who had connections to the leading princes and had access to the funds of the empire. So that BlackRock is essentially doing that today for the United States through its privileged position with the Federal Reserve.
The next question was, do they have any competition? Or is this just like another kind of royal privilege that you get granted by the powers that be?
Well, there are other equity funds and asset managers, Vanguard. There are a number of them, but none nearly as large as BlackRock. But also, what you have is these family funds, and a smaller one, but an example of this was Bernie Madoff. Apparently, this is what what's his name, Epstein was doing also. You have these management funds that just soak up money from wealthy people, and then they convince smaller the pension funds that run teachers funds or police union funds. And next thing you know, they're sitting on a pile of money, and they can help shape the trends going on in the markets. Now, the person who brought this into the modern Wall Street operation was Michael Milken, who figured out essentially how to get money from organized crime networks, especially the Jewish organized crime networks, the Lansky family, the Max Fisher gang from Detroit, and to bring that money through casinos and other ways, launder it, and then bring it into the purchase of junk bonds to create huge amounts of funds that they then made available to companies like Kohlberg Kravis Roberts, the biggest players in the leverage buyout and the acquisition funds. So the problem with Milken's operation is they used largely cash. And at a certain point, there's a famous story in the book, I think it's Barbarians at the Gate, that when they did the RJR Nabisco takeover, which was $27 billion, it took 3 days to get all that money through the Fed in a cash form. And so they concluded, this isn't going to work. We've got to go to much bigger amounts of money. And so they brought down Milken. Remember who it was who brought down Michael Milken and Drexel Burnham? None other than Rudy Giuliani, when he was the U.S. attorney in New York. And Milken, of course, got a year in Club Fed, where he sharpened his tennis game. And meanwhile, he was able to keep almost all of the money he made. And then he set up the Milken Institute. But after Milken's operation was brought down, what did they do? That's when derivatives came into being, where you could have even less money as leverage to create huge amounts of debt. And that was the buildup from the collapse of Milken's empire in 87, 88. Remember, we had a stock market crash in 87. And then we had another series of crashes in 97, 98. 99, you had the repeal of Glass-Steagall. And in 2000, we had the dot-com crash. And then what? Mortgage-backed securities and the explosion of investment in financial derivatives. So they've been going bigger and bigger and bigger with bigger Ponzi schemes, higher amounts of leverage. And that's what happened in 2008 when Lehman Brothers was sitting there with $1 of real assets for every $37 of debt. And they concluded that they had to let Lehman collapse. And then all of a sudden they were looking at a domino style collapse, and they had to come up with the TARP plan and literally trillions of dollars to bail out Wall Street. And then from that time to the present, the amount has just gone up and up and up. So this is what the everything debt bubble is. You know, it all goes back to these funny money schemes from the 80s that actually took off because of Nixon removing the dollar from gold in 1971.
Harley, that's an incredibly valuable summary of the past 30, 40 years. And that's what I can't thank you enough for making yourself available to us, because that kind of summarizing of things from Michael Milken and Bernie Madoff to the present, and you show us how these things developed one out of the next and the next, the next. And now they're at a point where their bubble is so big that they're basically trying to put a mortgage on the entire planet.
Well, this is what the Great Reset and the Green New Deal is about. But let me just go back a step, because some of this goes back to the British Empire and the establishment of Hong Kong as the financial center, because the British used Hong Kong for drug money laundering after the Second Opium War against China. Now, why is that important? Because that opened the door for the Boston Brahmin and others in the United States to become junior partners of drug money banks like the Bank of Hong Kong and Shanghai. Barclays was involved in this. And the League of Nations did an investigation of this in the early 20s, looking into money laundering. And they found that many of these banks had two sets of books. One was the official set, and the other was the unofficial hidden set of books through which they took the money from drugs, gun running, organized crime, prostitution rackets, and so on. And not surprisingly, if you really know something about the operations of the OSS, you find that Lucky Luciano, the sometime partner of Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel, was brought in by the OSS to work with them on two grounds. One, because they had an operation on the shipyards, and so they brought them in to make sure the shipyards didn't have a lot of Nazi spies in them. This is when Manhattan and New York City, the Brooklyn Naval Yard, were still building ships. And then later they sent Luciano to negotiate with the drug mafia in Sicily to help ease the way for the American troops to do the landing in southern Italy. So, and this is, of course, what you were talking about with your father's work later on with Southern Air Transport and Air America, where the drug gangs ceased to exist as that form of organized crime and became instead a function of the CIA, because the CIA learned something from all of that. So this is not esoteric knowledge. This is up to date how you run a global empire. And the fact is that the bank I mentioned, Hongshang, or the Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank, that was set up explicitly as a drug bank in 1863, 64. Even to this day, they're constantly hit with fines because they're caught laundering drug money. Why have they not been shut down? Why has their board members not been put in prison? If you catch a kid on the street selling a dime bag of Coke or something, or marijuana, they could get 20 years. You have bank officials laundering billions of dollars, and they get a slap on the wrist. So this is where you see the interconnection of the old organized crime with what we call the deep state today.
Harley, I must be 15 years ago now that I saw a video of now gone, but the writer Robert Anton Wilson. I wonder if you ever run into him.
No.
He was kind of uh, um, he was very much into studying the connection between the CIA and organized crime in the 50s and 60s. And one of the things that he was really good at was distinguishing, was to show that, remember when Roberto Calvi was killed and
Oh, yeah,
he hung up.
Propaganda Due Lodge.
That's it. This was his area of expertise, was Robert Anton Wilson. And what his analysis has just stuck with me. And what he said was, the CIA has now gotten in bed with the mafia, but time will tell who ends up on top in that match, because neither the CIA nor the mafia is in a position to submit. They both are, we are the king of the mountain type of organizations. And I think the mafia still is quite powerful in the sense that it can do the most horrific things to people that don't cooperate with them. And
I think I would argue that because of the power of the military and the CIA, that the mafia, so-called, like United Fruit Company, for example, perfect example, they weren't just shipping bananas in from Central America, they were laundering a lot of drugs, and they were protected. And this was part of the CIA operations. So they would call on the mafia at times to do hits. In fact, I think the investigation, the turbid investigation into the Kennedy assassination, identifies organized crime hit teams from Spain and France that were probably involved on the grassy knoll in the Kennedy assassination. They did a fake investigation into Carlos Marcello and the New Orleans mob, but I think it was actually European gangs. And that's important because the whole story of Propaganda Due, which you just mentioned. And this fits in with the Operation Gladio, which was left right-wing terrorism in the 60s and 70s in Europe, which included bombing at the Bologna train station. It included the kidnapping and murder of Prime Minister Aldo Moro, the Prime Minister of Italy. And what was Moro's crime? He decided to save Italy, he had to bring some communists into the government.
mm-hmm.
And at that point, they moved on him. And then, you think about the United States in this. Are you familiar with the Jacobs family of Buffalo, New York? Does that ring a bell?
Not to me, no.
They had a company called Emprise, which later became Sports Services. And they really had a hard time breaking into the casinos, the casino business. So what they did is they took over urban parking lots at sports stadiums, which is a great place to launder money, where no one really knows how many cars come and go in a parking lot. I mean, you don't have people watching these things, and it's very easy to put 10,000 here, 20,000 there, and move it. And this was a part of the same organized crime family that divided up the upper Midwest with the Bronfmans, who are probably more famous because of the Seagram's label, and Edgar Bronfman, who later became a so-called philanthropist. But this is part of the hidden story of the corruption and how these families moved in to become legitimate or so-called legitimate operations, because they basically either bought their way into the establishment, or in the case of Milken was taking their money. I actually helped co-write a book called The Ugly Truth About the Anti-Defamation League, because the Anti-Defamation League of B'nai B'rith was originally set up to protect Jewish gangsters in New York who were being investigated in the teens for organized crime. And they basically said calling them gangsters is anti-Semitic. Well, there was a Jewish mafia. just as there was an Italian mafia and a Russian mafia. But the ADL, anytime someone would look into people like Bronfman or Max Fisher or Lansky and Bugsy Siegel and these networks, they would be attacked as anti-Semites. So it was a very effective way of protecting them. And later on, through Michael Milken, this money went to people like Ronald Perlman. I don't know if that name's familiar, but Perlman was one of the leveraged buyout operatives who became very influential philanthropist. He moved from the Drexel Burnham operation to his own hedge fund. And so this whole drug mafia operation became the basis of a lot of the hedge funds and the money laundering that then went into derivative trading. So in that sense, Bernie Madoff was a somewhat small guy, but an example of how Ponzi schemes were funded with a certain amount of liquidity from dirty money that could then be leveraged through the banks and now through the Federal Reserve into trillions of dollars. And so what's the latest? The Green New Deal. And this just went on at the meeting in England, or Great Britain, the G7 meeting, where they put forward this idea of the Clean Green Initiative. Now, technically, what they're saying is that China is using their Belt and Road Initiative to put nations in debt, to take over nations, to force nations to let China set up military bases and so on. Now, the fact is that Chinese haven't set up military bases. In fact, what are they doing? They're building infrastructure. They're building railroads. They're building coal power plants. Half of sub-Saharan Africa does not have electricity. Half of the population in sub-Saharan Africa does not have electricity. And now they're being told by the G7, well, we'll give you money to sell your carbon offsets, but you can't develop coal plants. You can't go with China. We'll give you money through the carbon markets so that you can at least keep your people alive. And the Africans are saying they don't want that. They want the coal power plants. They want economic development. So Biden and Boris Johnson pushed this initiative to supposedly come up with $100 billion to counter the Belt and Road Initiative. Now, the Chinese have spent much more than that already since 2013 developing real infrastructure. So this really isn't designed to compete with China, but it's designed to create a huge fund of so-called green financial assets that some of it will go into solar power and wind power and the retrofitting and things of that sort. Most of it, though, will go through this big Federal Reserve fund that BlackRock is sitting on. And they're talking about 30 to 60 to $100 trillion eventually between central bank money and private equity funds that will be available to the speculators to keep the bubble going. So that's the real story of what was going on at the G7 meeting. Now, whether Biden knows any of this, I don't know. Certainly, there are people around him who are very familiar with this, but no one's going to talk about it, are they?
Well, no, and that's a combination of both the CIA's and the mafia and all the other intelligence agencies. People are scared.
And the corporate media. The corporate media is very much a part of this.
Now, speaking of which, I don't know if you've seen it yet over there in Europe, but Jon Stewart, the famous American so-called comedian, who has a propaganda show, or did for many years on our public broadcasting. Jon Stewart himself came out on Colbert's show, Stephen Colbert's show, saying, "Hey, it's a lab leak. It's not. This whole zoonotic idea of pangolin to woolly mammoths to whatever is a bunch of nonsense." And to me, when somebody of his stature, because the liberal, the left, they love Jon Stewart. He
Yeah.
is like the leader of the opinions of millions of pussy hats and all of these. Excuse me, but I'm really a little bit angry at these people that keep their heads in the sand and don't watch what's really going on and believe
Yeah.
people like Jon Stewart. But even when he comes out and says, that, well, then we're going to find that finally there's a crack in the media, and we're going to start getting some actual stuff about how this thing got started. And I don't want to try to argue it myself. I'm not a scientist, but I have been following this for so long that I am absolutely convinced that this was not a natural occurrence. But what I think doesn't matter so much. But when a Jon Stewart, with his incredible audience, comes out and says that, I think the tide is turning. I think we're going to see some real attention to the fact that there are labs around the world. They are generally sponsored by the United States or NATO that do create these bioweapons, and they create the virus and they create the vaccine, and they experiment with them, and they turn people into human guinea pigs just so that they can run their next trials. And I am sick and tired of the media that won't admit that. But thank God we've got at least a Jon Stewart that's going to, I think, be very influential. Excuse me for making that comment, but I've been dying to say something about it and you said major media, so I jumped in. So
let me give you another
off
example.
our topic, but I think it's important that people realize that if you keep, people work very hard on this for over a year now, year and a half, to try to force people, the media, to look at this and stop saying nonsense theories about bats and pangolins and pigs and stuff. Let's get serious. Look at the science. Thank you.
Well, you have something similar with climate change. In
Yeah.
Italy, it started with 50 scientists, then 500, then 800. Now there are over 1,200 scientists who are researchers and PhDs in actual climate science and astrophysics who are circulating a document which says there is no climate emergency. And of course, they're accused of being climate deniers, a way of making it sound as though they're Holocaust deniers. But they went to the universities, some of the universities in Italy, especially where you had a lot of these man-made global warming people. And they said, look, let's have an honest debate. Let's set up some debates, a series of debates. So the first one was held, I think, 2 weeks ago, and they had invited 3 of the top so-called experts in man-made climate change, and none of them showed up, naturally. But this is going to continue to build. Now, one of the points that was made by one of the astrophysicists is explain why NASA has just discovered that Venus is hotter today than it's ever been since we've been able to measure it. What's causing global warming on Venus? So, some of these lies that they have ultimately are going to be cracked. Just like, technically, but here's the problem, John. This is why this is so important, what you're bringing up. The story of Russian meddling in the US election, which was cooked up initially by British intelligence, the GCHQ, claiming they had evidence of cyber attacks underway. Then it was merged with Christopher Steele, the former MI6 guy who wrote the PP dossier about Trump. And then the, crowdsource, I think it is, the company that was the cyber security for the DNC website for Podesta and others, put out a story saying that, CrowdStrike, that there was Russian hacking. But the president of that company, when he was brought before a congressional hearing and was questioned about the evidence, said, well, we had evidence that there was someone trying to hack it, but we had no evidence that any documents were exfiltrated. In other words, there was no hacking that took the documents out of the DNC computers and gave them to WikiLeaks. Now, you still hear liars like Adam Schiff and Pelosi and others saying Russian hacking, Russian meddling in the 2016 election. Now they're saying it was in 2020 election, it was in Brexit, it was in the French elections, and on and on and on. They keep pushing the lies even after the so-called evidence they had was disproven. So, the old Yiddish proverb is the truth never dies, but it lives a miserable life. Well, that's what we're seeing here. But you need people who fight for the truth. And, I look at your program and the work that you've done to unearth not just the role of your father, but all the others, the whistleblowers who have come out with stories about the corruption of this cabal and the so-called deep state. And it takes courage, it takes persistence, but eventually the truth will come out. The question is, will we still have a human race by the time we get that truth out?
Yeah. Well, yeah, thanks. And it's just, what else can we do but keep on trying? And I don't have a truth detector in my brain. I don't have the ability to say, oh, well, this is the truth, and here I'm going to publish it, for everybody to learn it. No, but what I have, one of the things that I do think I would share with people that want to participate in unearthing the truth is to accept the fact that nobody has a handle on all of the truth, and that while one person might be completely enlightening on one subject, they might make an error on something else. And if you focus on the error that they made on the other thing and throw out, the baby with the proverbial bathwater, then you're not going to learn anything. So what we have to do is to take what works for us, what we think is heading up toward the truth, and then don't get excited about the other stuff that people are a little wrong about. I can distinguish myself from many people on various collateral issues.
Mm-hmm.
But when it comes right down to it, we're all fighting for the survival of this republic and the freedom of the people that built this republic has to be preserved. The liberty that was guaranteed to us when our ancestors and our forebears, and you don't have to be a blood ancestor to be an ancestor to claim the ancestry of the founding fathers and the founding mothers, as pointed out. All of these things are our blessings, the blessings on their posterity. Well, we're their posterity, and we should be enhancing these blessings for our posterity, and not sitting back on our bums waiting for Jon Stewart to figure it out.
Well, John, the interesting thing, I worked for over 40 years with Lyndon LaRouche, and LaRouche made many, many forecasts in those years, most of which have proven to be accurate. Now, he talked a lot about a method of inquiry, a scientific method, and he went back to the great thinkers in history, starting with Socrates and Plato, the so-called Socratic method, where you engage in a real dialogue, where you're not trying to make it about yourself, but about the search for truth. And of course, Socrates famously said, "The only thing I know is that I know nothing." And that you have to prove things. And you have these famous dialogues like the Meno dialogue, where they're trying to discover how to make certain geometric functions occur. And the slave boy is the one who figures it out. In other words, you don't necessarily have to have credentials to figure things out. And what LaRouche insisted on is that if you look at the progression of scientific knowledge and the relationship of that to the building of the principle of a republic, go from Plato, you go through people like Nicholas of Cusa, the great cardinal from the middle of the 15th century, to Kepler, the famous scientist who made discoveries based on intuition, his thought processes. Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, who's famous for his idea that you the idea in our Constitution, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, as opposed to property. Property was the John Locke British Empire idea. Leibniz convinced, or studying Leibniz, led to the idea of pursuit of happiness. And you look through the period from then to now, and you find great thinkers who operated not on empiricism, not on what they see or what they had experienced, but on thought objects, on intuition, on coming up with hypotheses, and then developing experiments to prove that. Well, we have one great experiment, which is the American Constitutional Republic. And when we've applied the principles of the founding fathers when it comes to liberty, when it comes to real wealth versus type property titles and things of that sort, or titles of nobility rather. When you look at what Alexander Hamilton did as an economic model based on banking that is there for the purpose of making credit available to people who can add to the real wealth of the society, not to personal wealth through speculation. Whenever we've applied that in the United States, we've had great prosperity, but more importantly, the prosperity was a driver, not for people to become rich, but for developing new ideas, for science and technology and the application of new technologies to improve the productivity of the workforce so that you could add value to the real economy. That's the American experiment. And we also know, when we go back to the British view of neoliberalism, of free trade, of whatever the market will bear, where you put a price on something, a monetary price, as opposed to a valuation based on the ability to increase the benefits for the future, we see the difference. And the last 40 years, we've increasingly been dominated by this neoliberal economic theory, which was the Republican Party in the 70s and 80s. And then with Bill Clinton and Al Gore and the so-called Third Way and Tony Blair from England, we increasingly went toward a democratic endorsement of neoliberalism, free trade, and so on. And so here we are today because of that, with an unbelievable, unsustainable series of debt bubbles, any number of which could pop at any time. And what's the solution of those neoliberals? Keep pumping money. They developed something called modern monetary theory, which basically says there's no problem with doing this. Don't worry about the deficits. Well, it's not the deficits you worry about so much. It's how do you assure that you won't have a hyperinflation that will steal the wealth of every single person, working person, who's fought during a lifetime to have enough money to have a home, a certain amount of security, a retirement. All of that gets eaten up with a hyperinflation. The only people who make out from that are the ones who get the money from the central banks, namely the BlackRock people and their clients. So we're at a critical moment in world history. And I think these summits, on the surface, what's the big news? Biden says the America is back and that we're now going back to multilateralism. Well, this isn't multilateralism. This rules-based order is the opposite of multilateralism. It's we make the rules and you do what we say, or you're the enemy. You're on the outside. We'll cut off your credit. We'll cut you out of the SWIFT system, the transaction system. We'll stop your trade. We'll steal your assets in the banking system. Well, is that a multilateral system? No, that's an empire. And that's what was reasserted at the G7 and then backed up by NATO, saying NATO is no longer just a military alliance. It's a political military alliance, but it's global. And so now NATO is going to be sending forces to participate in the containment of China, as well as the attempt to contain Russia. And what does it mean to contain them? What is Russia doing? Did Russia really invade these other countries? Now, the Russians provided some backup to the ethnic Russians in eastern Ukraine who were coming under assault by ethnic cleansers who used the Nazis as a model, who are trying to drive them out of the Donbass region. So the idea this is Russian aggression is a complete fairy tale. But how many people know that? How many people know that Biden worked with Victoria Nuland and George Soros and neo-Nazis to run the coup in Ukraine in February 2014? Not many people. So you're right, John, we have to keep getting the real story out there and not be discouraged when people say, how do you know that? Or I don't know that. Or, that's part of the conditions of being a truth seeker.
Yes, and to have we've got what, maybe 1,000 people every week that watch our show, and that's everybody knows a couple of hundred people, so you can project that we're making some type of an impact, and I think that's all we can hope for, is to just reach out and keep other people reaching out. I appreciate very much the support that I get on Patreon and otherwise, because it helps me to produce better shows and get the word out. Let me go over to your shelf for a second, because you always put a book out that you're highlighting for some reason, or maybe you just picked it up and set it back. But an author that I find kind of controversial, and I don't know how to properly say his first name. I think it's Niall Ferguson.
I think it's Neil.
Neil Ferguson. Okay.
Yeah.
And the book Empire, I'm not familiar with. Tell us a little bit about Mr. Ferguson and his work, and why you chose to put that book there this morning, if you don't mind.
Well, the subtitle of this book, Empire, is The Rise and Demise of the British World Order and the Lessons for Global Power. Now, Ferguson claims he's not an apologist for empire, but he is. You read his book and you see. And he was lamenting the fact that the British Empire went into after World War II, went into a period of stagnation. They lost some of their colonies, but he's part of the lie that the British Empire no longer exists. He leaves out the City of London and the role the City of London has continued to play in shaping international finance. And so the two reasons I put this up, one is that Ferguson's writing and his history work, on this whole question of the demise of empire, was taken to heart by people like Dominic Cummings, who was one of the key advisors to Boris Johnson on how to revive the British Empire, the idea of global Britain. Now, I don't know if people have heard of this. If you read the British press at all, you'll see that it was a big issue for a while around Boris Johnson. Global Britain was after Brexit. How does Britain come back as a major force in international trade and so on? And Johnson and others were basically saying, well, freed from the constraints of the European Union, they can become directly a partner of the United States in shaping global policy. And this was Johnson's idea of how to shape both the G7 summit, which this year was in Great Britain, and also the Glasgow conference in November of the Paris Climate Accord, the COP26. So how could he use these two events to bring Britain back into the center of being an imperial power? And if you saw the first day of Biden's arrival in Great Britain, what did he do? He embraced the royal family and he embraced Boris Johnson. And everyone was told, oh, Boris Johnson, he's a Trump guy. He's a nationalist, a sovereigntist. No, he's an operative of the British Empire. And the famous statement of the British Empire was from Lord Palmerston: we have no permanent friends, only permanent interests. Boris Johnson dropped his friendship with Donald Trump sometime between November 3rd of 2020 and January 6th, and went into an embrace of Joe Biden. Perfect example of the British Empire. So Ferguson sort of laid out this, you've got to have a new perspective. But what's the new perspective? How do you include, or how do you incorporate the financial power of the City of London into protecting the interests of the British Empire. And the British Empire has nothing to do with the people of England. It has to do with the corporate cartels that are based in London and also around the world that have interlocking boards of directors and so on. Now, the second reason I put it up there is that Ferguson was the source of one of the big lies following the explosion of the COVID pandemic. He wrote an article which said that the Chinese deliberately sent flights from Wuhan all over the world after they had discovered the disease was in Wuhan. And this became a story that was pushed by Pompeo. Trump repeated it regularly. And he said the flights continued out of Wuhan. Well, an enterprising university professor from California, who also sometimes teaches in China, did an investigation of this. And he found that on January 23rd, all flights from Wuhan were canceled, whereas Ferguson said they continued into March. Now, when Ferguson was presented with the evidence, he said, quote, "Well, maybe my facts were wrong on the date, but the principle is still the same. The Chinese shipped this flu all over the world." So that's, the one of the sources of this argument that the Chinese were the ones who developed the COVID disease and sent it around the world as a bioweapon. I think we'll find, and by the way, the latest evidence on this that was touted by the Wall Street Journal was produced by this so-called journalist named Gordon, who was 32 years with the New York Times. He was one of the co-authors with Judith Miller of the original story in 2002 that said Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. He's the source that these so-called 3 sick researchers from the Wuhan lab were the first people to contract COVID. The Chinese have made available all the medical records of those 3 people. And yet the story has now made the rounds repeatedly that, no, this was the first case of COVID coming from the lab. So I think we've got to withhold judgment on some of these things. But Ferguson was one of the first people to jump in and provide Pompeo and then Trump with the argument that this was a China flu, a China bioweapon.
Yeah, thank you for that, and thanks for being willing to delve into the literature of the people that are behind these schemes or putting them together. It's like Rhodes's roundtable deducts. It's like how can we fix this so that Rhodes's roundtable dream comes true, that the whole world becomes a nice organized place run by really rational Anglo-Saxons.
I'm not so sure they like the idea of the Saxons too much, although I guess that's Prince Philip's background. Well, John,
go ahead.
Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, I think I've just been reading a book by Sean Stone, who is the son of the filmmaker Oliver Stone, who wrote a book called New World Order and published it a few years ago. I hadn't noticed it until last week, and I said, wow, it's the latest version that I've got of putting all of this Rhodes roundtable in together with all of the other characters that we've run into. And it just strikes me how racist the whole thing is. It didn't really hit me until I read it in his book, where he said when the British created the Commonwealth of Nations, they said we're gonna give all of our former colonies, like Canada and Australia and New Zealand, we're going to give them domestic autonomy. We're still going to expect them to work together with us on international issues, but domestically we're going to let them run their own show, because they're reasonable Anglo-Saxon people and they can do it. But when it comes to other colonies, ones that were run by people that didn't have that English or Saxon or whatever the lineage,
that weren't white.
They weren't white, in the sense of Anglo-Saxon whiteness. They didn't get self-rule. They became trusteeships, and some really smart white people were put into the trustees to make sure that all the natives, gradually, slowly, at their own pace, because they're not very smart, learned how to run their own country. But they certainly don't know how to do it today.
Well, the perfect example of that, John, is Rhodesia, a country in Africa that was named after Cecil Rhodes because that was the source of a lot of his mineral wealth. So there's definitely an element of that which continues to this day. Look at the number of Rhodes scholars in and around the so-called deep state. Susan Rice is an example. Bill Clinton is an example. Rhodes had in his initial will that the Rhodes Scholarship Fund was to recruit Americans to recognize the importance of being in an alliance with the British Empire. And this predates Churchill's discussion of the special relationship by, 5 or 6 decades. So this is an important point, that the empire can change its form, but it still has a certain view of man, which is that you have a certain grouping that's superior, that has the right to shape events according to their benefit. Now we're going to have, I just wanted to say, we have a conference coming up on the 26th and 27th of June. It's an online conference, the Schiller Institute. We've had at the last 2 or 3 of these, we've had representatives of the Russian government, the Chinese government, the Italian government, former officials from the French government, the German government, scientists, political activists, the media, the head of the media office of President Assad in Syria. And we've had them together to have discussions of how do we get out of these crises? What's the solution to the continuing wars in Southwest Asia? How do you deal with poverty in whole sections of the world, Africa and Asia? What do we need to do to build up a world-class healthcare system for every country? And how do we get out of this inflationary bubble and restore real economic growth for the whole world? So this is going to be a 2-day conference starting, I think, at 9 or 10 Eastern time on the 26th of June. And anyone who wants to find out more about it could go to theschillerinstitute.com, and it's right up there on our homepage. Or if you want more from me on that, you can just write to me at harleysch@gmail.com. It's my personal email, and I'll be happy to get you some of the relevant documents.
Well, once again, we're grateful to you, Harley Schlanger of the LaRouche Organization and the Schiller Institute. They've been working for decades to steer this country and this world in a path of peace. And I support them with every show that I can, because I whether I agree with everything they say is not important. What's important is that they are a real seeker of truth and a people who are seeking to produce a safe and peaceful world for the next generations. Thank you, Harley Schlanger, for being with us this morning. And thank you, Andy DeBala. I'm so glad you're feeling better for producing. Tonight, guys, I'll have Bill Taylor on the show. So I will be doing an evening show tonight at 8 p.m., just FYI. Thanks again, Harley. Have a great rest of the day, everybody. And we'll see you tonight.